Welcome to the Must Reads Classics interview series, sponsored by the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence. In this series, we talk about homiletical books from the past that still have an important voice for preachers to listen to today. I'm Wes Allen, and I'm excited to have with me David Jacobsen, who is the Bishop Scholar in Homiletics and Preaching and the Director of the Homiletical Theology Project at Boston University School of Theology. Dr. Jacobsen is a prolific scholar, but he's generously agreed to join us today to talk about the work of someone else, his professor, David Buttrick. Buttrick was the Drusilla Moore Buffington Professor of Homiletics and Liturgics at Vanderbilt Divinity School, where he taught many preachers and homileticians over the years. We're going to be discussing Buttrick's 1987 book, Homiletic Moves and Structures, which is certainly one of the most influential books on preaching from the second half of the 20th century. So, David, welcome to Must Reads. Buttrick's homiletic is a widely considered part of sort of an influential part of the new homiletic movement of the 1970s and 80s. And I don't want to go into much detail about the new homiletic, but one part of that was a move toward the listener, a shift from earlier homiletical approaches. But Buttrick did that differently than others in his day. So I'm just wondering if that might be a place for us to start, with you saying a word about his unique approach to turn to the listener.
Sure. So for Buttrick, I think if you were to understand from his own position why the new homiletic was important, he might say regarding his own approach to preaching that what we need is a turn to the listeners in the plural. And what he meant by that, of course, was also very unique. He thought in many ways we're constituted by language and culture already. Within the context of the turn to the listeners, he also argued that listeners were not simply walled off within a church culture, but also part of a wider culture at the same time, which is why he could talk in his hermeneutic about being saved in the world. The way he approached listeners was markedly different from a lot of the people of his time. And also, I think in many ways prescient about some of the issues that face us in preaching today, in trying to make sure we do more than address the individual heart or the individual mind in preaching. And that was a very powerful component of his work.
So part of the way he turned to the listener was to argue that for the community to hear the sermon and be on the same page as move through, to create this communal consciousness, he proposed moves being structured in a certain way across the sermon. And that continues to be an influential part of it. So I'm wondering, would you explain what Buttrick meant by moves?
Sure. So I had the good fortune of studying with David Buttrick as an MDiv student in his intro class before I ever studied with him as a PhD student later. So I was exposed to that method in a very thoroughgoing way and have been living with it for years. I think that's part of the genius of what he does, is to argue that moves help to shape that communal consciousness, and ways in which we use our language to organize our work sermonically becomes important for making an impression upon a group of hearers. So the language he sometimes uses is phenomenological approaches to preaching. He referred to his own method as a patchwork phenomenology for preaching. The key thing to know is that he's always thinking about how our language helps to form language in consciousness, in a kind of shared consciousness, which meant that when you set up a move, you set up very clear signs at the beginning of a move. They would tend to last maybe 3 or 3.5 minutes, and then the end of a move. And that these would become sort of the basic modules of a sermon. It seems counterintuitive because it's not the way you speak in normal one-to-one conversation. But having clear signs of opening a move and then closing a move are very much an act of neighbor love. It allows the consecutive parts of a sermon each to form in congregational consciousness. I don't think the way Buttrick did that is always as helpful to appreciate now, because sometimes the rules around that feel a little pedantic. But the insight beneath it is actually very important and deep. When we speak to people and they are hearing, it's a little bit more like piloting an oil tanker than it is driving a speedboat. And so the beauty of Buttrick's approach is that it gives time for each move to form and for hearers to tag along through that process and to hang together as a congregation.
Yeah, I had a student, I've shared the story before, that I forced to read Buttrick and write a sermon like Buttrick, and he felt like those moves were very pedantic, but the congregation did not. They experienced it as very creative. They were able to follow through with the sermon from beginning to end that way. And so it was a real lesson on what we as preachers experience in the sermon may not be what the community experiences.
Well, and that's right. And one of the things that still strikes me, because I use Buttrick's approach, especially in terms of move structure and the way I preach my own sermons, is the number of times I'm approached by children who actually say that's the first sermon I've understood in a while. So there's a real appeal to realizing that the oral word is a very fragile thing, and that preachers out of neighbor love need to attend to the way we use language in a way that can reach hearers. So if you can get past all the rules and focus on neighbor love, you'll be in the right space in order to think about how your language can enable what you say to be heard and to register in the consciousness of your hearers.
So, I mean, Buttrick came around in this time where there was a lot of new talk about how to structure sermons. Craddock's inductive, the Lowry loop, the move to celebration, the use of story form, and that kind of stuff. And he went much deeper into details with these moves, but he was also concerned with the wider movement from move to move, and how those works. You want to say anything about that?
Sure. Well, Buttrick's homiletic is called, the subtitle is Moves and Structures. So we haven't really talked about structure yet, but right. It is very important for him. I think the first thing to be aware of is that Buttrick argues that sermons can take three basic shapes. One is called preaching in the mode of immediacy, which might be closest to what we would normally think of as like a narrative sermon, where each move represents a part of the narrative plot, replotted by the preacher, and then organized in that way. The second is called preaching in the mode of reflection, which then allows us to sort of consider a text, but reflect on it from a bit of a distance, bracketing some of the immediacies of it that would find its way into our own awareness. So it's you're not coming in as quite as hot as you would with preaching in the mode of immediacy. And the third, and this one is really almost ignored, is Buttrick's idea of preaching in the mode of praxis. So he would argue that sermons that want to help make sense in situations need to be organized around the theological moves we make in coming to an understanding about a given human situation. Topical preaching has kind of taken it on the chin in a lot of circles over the last few years. Another term I've heard people use is occasional preaching. I use the term situational preaching, but Buttrick, I think, was the first to say the idea of preaching in the mode of praxis would be a way to make that turn to the hearer and also begin to unpack human situations in a unique way. And so the capacity to do those three things is actually very important for preachers who are occupying spaces of leadership in a church, to be able to speak to a text, to let the text run a little bit, to be able to reflect on texts. That's also important, but also to be able to stop and reflect deeply on praxis and situations. That's really the range of what I think a lot of pastoral ministry is in a postmodern age. And I think it really commends itself even now for differentiating the way we might approach sermon structure.
Well, I agree. Thank you for that. I mean, I find myself, even though I was not a student of Buttrick, going back to his book over and over again, not only for the broad arguments about moves and structures, but every page has little bits of advice on them for the preacher that are so helpful. His arguments about matrix of imagery in a sermon, holding it together, things like that. I just hope some of our viewers will go out and find this book or pick it back off your shelf if it's got dust on it and revisit it. There's so much there. So David, thank you for spending a little time with us talking about your professor, another David, and we'll have you back before long. Thanks, David.
Great. Thank you.